Most people think they understand the story of Medusa, a monster with snakes for hair whose gaze turns people to stone, something to fear, something to avoid, something a hero is meant to defeat. And when the story is told that way, it feels simple, clean, like everything is already decided before it even begins. But that version only works if you start from a distance, because Medusa wasn't always a monster. She became one. And that shift matters more than anything else in the story. Because once you actually sit with that, once you start from the beginning instead of the ending, it stops feeling like a story about fear and starts feeling like a story about something much harder to look at, something slower, something that doesn't resolve cleanly, because it forces you to pay attention to what happened before anyone ever called her a monster. And once you do that, it becomes a lot harder to accept the version of the story people usually tell. Most people are introduced to Medusa as something already defined: the snakes, the gaze, the danger, something fully formed, something easy to understand, the kind of figure that fits into a story where the roles are already assigned. There's a threat, and there's someone who is meant to deal with it. And once those roles are set, the story moves forward without asking too many questions. But that version removes the part that gives the story weight. Because Medusa doesn't begin as something people would fear. She begins as someone people would admire. Someone who existed in the same world as everyone else. Someone who wasn't isolated, wasn't avoided, wasn't something to look away from. And that difference matters, because it means the story isn't about something that was always dangerous. It's about something that became that way. And once you recognize that, it changes how everything that follows feels. Because it's no longer inevitable. It's something that happened. In the version of the myth that stays with people, Medusa was once human. A woman known for her beauty, something that drew attention without effort. And that kind of attention doesn't stay neutral. It doesn't just exist quietly. It changes things. It changes how people approach you, how they talk to you, how they look at you. It creates expectations before you've even done anything. And over time, that attention stops being something you receive and starts being something you have to carry. Something you must deal with whether you want to or not. And that's where the story begins to shift. Not in something dramatic, but in something familiar. The way attention turns into pressure. The way presence turns into expectation. And then Poseidon enters the story. And what follows isn't framed as something she chooses. It's something that happens to her. And that moment is where everything changes, even if the story doesn't stay there long enough to fully sit with it. Because instead of that moment leading to consequences for him, the focus moves somewhere else. Toward her. Toward the person who now carries the result of what happened. And that's where the story becomes difficult to ignore. Athena punishes Medusa, not Poseidon, not the one who caused the harm, Medusa. And that decision reshapes everything, because it removes the cause from the center of the story and replaces it with the outcome. Her body changes. Her appearance becomes something people can't look at without consequence. Something that forces distance. Something that removes her from the world she was part of before. And that's where the tragedy deepens. Because it's not just that something was done to her. It's that the result of that moment becomes the reason she is separated from everything else. The reason she is feared. The reason she is avoided. She becomes the visible version of something people would rather not confront directly. And once that happens, it becomes easier to react to her than to question what created her. This is where the story slows down, even if most versions don't spend time here. Because what happens to Medusa isn't just a transformation, it's a removal. Not just from people, but from everything that made her part of the world before. She doesn't just look different. She becomes something people physically cannot approach. Something they cannot even look at without consequence. And that kind of isolation isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just becomes the new reality. No conversation, no connection. no chance to be seen as anything other than what she's been turned into. And over time, that kind of separation does something to a person. Not all at once, but slowly. Because when the world stops interacting with you as a person, it becomes harder to hold on to that version of yourself, harder to remember it, harder to believe it still exists at all. That's what makes Medusa more than a monster. She becomes a pattern, the shape that punishment takes when justice refuses to look upward. When power doesn't confront power, it redirects downward. It finds something easier to reshape, easier to contain, easier to blame. And once that shift happens, the story changes. It's no longer about what happened. It's about what can be seen. Because people don't interact with causes, they interact with outcomes. They respond to what's in front of them. And if what's in front of them feels uncomfortable or unfamiliar or difficult to understand, it becomes easier to define it than to question it. And once something is defined that way, it becomes fixed. It becomes something people expect to see, something they stop questioning entirely. The story feels familiar because this pattern doesn't stay in mythology. It shows up in smaller, quieter ways. Something happens, and instead of asking what caused it, people focus on how it looks now, how it feels now, how it affects them now. And that becomes the conversation. Not the harm, but the aftermath. Not the cause, but the result. And that shift doesn't feel intentional. It feels natural. It feels like the easiest way to understand what's in front of you. But it also avoids the part that matters. Because looking at the cause requires sitting with something uncomfortable, something that doesn't resolve easily. And most people don't stay there long. They move to something simpler, something they can react to, something they can label. And once something is labeled, it becomes easier to move past it without thinking about it any further. It doesn't have to be something extreme to recognize this. It can be smaller than that. Someone goes through something, and instead of asking what they went through, people start reacting to how they are now. Maybe they're more closed off. Maybe they're harder to read. Maybe they don't respond the way they used to. And that becomes the focus. Not the reason it changed, but the change itself. And once that happens, it becomes easier to distance from them than to understand them. It is easier to say they're different than to ask why. And that shift doesn't feel cruel when it's happening. It feels normal. It feels like reacting to what's in front of you. But it creates the same pattern. The cause fades out, and the outcome becomes the only thing that matters. If you enjoy breaking stories down like this, please like the video and consider subscribing. Then, Perseus enters the story, the hero, the one remembered for ending it. And by the time he arrives, everything about Medusa has already been decided. She's already been defined as something dangerous, something that needs to be dealt with. And that changes how his actions are seen. Because once someone has been turned into a monster in the eyes of the world, removing them doesn't feel like harm. It feels justified. It feels necessary. And that's what makes that part of the story difficult to sit with. Because by the time Perseus kills her, it doesn't feel like a tragedy. It feels like resolution, like something that restores order. And that's the part that lingers. Not the act itself, but how easily it fits into the narrative once everything before it has been accepted without question. Medusa is terrifying, but not in the way people usually think. She's not terrifying because of what she does. She's terrifying because of what her story reveals. The idea that someone can be changed by what happens to them, and then treated as if that change is their fault. That visible results become more important than the invisible cause. And once that shift happens, it becomes difficult to reverse. Because people don't respond to what they can't see. They respond to what's in front of them. And if what's in front of them feels easier to define than to understand, that's the direction they take. And over time, that becomes the only version that remains. What makes that even heavier is that Medusa never gets a moment where the story corrects itself. There's no part where someone steps in and says this shouldn't have happened. No moment where the focus shifts back to the cause. Everything just continues forward as if the outcome is what matters most. And that's what makes it feel complete, even when it isn't. Because once a story settles on a version of someone, it rarely goes back and questions it. It just builds on top of it. And over time, that version becomes the only one people remember. Not who they were, not what happened to them, just what they became. That's where the tragedy really settles in. Because Medusa doesn't just lose something in a single moment, she loses it in everything that follows. In the way the world responds to what she's been turned into, in the way her identity is replaced with something people can point at instead of understand. And once that happens, there's no path back. No version of the story where she returns to what she was before. Only the version people are willing to see. And maybe that's what makes the story stay with people, even if they don't always realize why. Because it reflects something that still happens. The movement away from cause and toward outcome. The way something complicated gets reduced into something simple, just so it can be handled more easily. And the way a person can become defined by what was done to them, instead of being understood because of it. And once that shift happens, the story moves on, even if the damage doesn't.